provisional cast-on is used on projects where instead of casting on with a closed edge, you leave the bottoms of the stitches live and available to be picked up later on. There are a number of methods of doing this. I'm going to use some waste yarn and a crochet chain. In addition to your yarn and needles for your project, you will need a crochet hook and some waste yarn. You do not need to estimate yarn for provisional cast-on, you just need to ensure that you have sufficient yarn for the crochet chain. When working a long provisional cast-on, I tend to work directly from a ball of spare yarn rather than cut a length of waste yarn. The first step is to work a crochet chain with your waste yarn. The waste yarn I am using is a cotton yarn. It is best to use a slippery yarn that won't cling to your main yarn. I tend to use a hook size that is either the same size as the project I am casting on or bigger. Do not use too heavy a weight of yarn or too big a crochet hook, as this may make your provisional stitches bigger than those in the work, and you want to avoid doing that. Start with a slip knot, and then you chain as many stitches as the number of stitches that you are going to cast on, and then some extra stitches. I normally cast on about 4 to 5 extra chain stitches, just so that I have a little bit of space. Don't worry if you are not a crocheter. I am definitely not one, and this is the extent of my crochet. To make a crochet chain, take the hook in your right hand and wrap the yarn around your crochet hook, tensioning it with your left hand. Grasp the yarn with your hook and then bring it through the loop of yarn. This creates a single crochet chain. Continue doing one of these for each of the stitches that you want to cast on, plus the extra, as I mentioned before. When counting your chains, particularly when casting on for provisional cast-on method, I tend to count the bumps at the backs of the chains, because it is these that you will be picking up your stitches into. So in this case you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-ish. It doesn't matter as long as you have more than you need for the number of stitches that you want to pick up. Once I have chained the number of stitches that I need, I pull my yarn through the last of my chain stitches. Take one of the needles you are using for your project and your project yarn, turn over the crochet chain so that the bumps on the back are facing you, and then you're ready to pick up your stitches. Take your needle and insert it into the first of the bumps at the back of the crochet chain. Wrap your yarn around the needle to create your first stitch. Bring the yarn back through the bump, and that's your first stitch on your needle. Go into the next bump, wrap your yarn around knitwise, bring it back through, and that's your second stitch. This is very similar to picking up and knitting stitches along an edge. Continue working a stitch into each of the bumps along the back of the crochet chain until you have the number of stitches that you need. Once you have picked up all of the stitches that you need, you turn the work and continue to work the stitches as normal. You can ignore the crochet chain for now. One thing to look at here is how the stitches go around the crochet chain. What you can see is that they are the bumps at the bottom of each of the stitches. You will have one bump for each stitch that you have picked up. Well, almost. You'll have half for one of the stitches, but I'll show you how to fix that in just a moment. Once you've worked your piece and cast it off, you are now ready to pick up your stitches along the bottom of your work. The first thing to do, as I mentioned previously, is to create a full stitch out of the very first stitch that you knit. What I do is I take a darning needle and I sew my tail into my work. I then secure it as I would any other yarn tail. The reason you do this is that the first stitch you pick up along your provisional edge doesn't really have a bump on it because it is essentially your tail yarn that creates that bump. But you can see here that by weaving it into your work, you create a full bump out of it which is then ready to become a stitch. Once you've done that, you pick up all of the loops of yarn, the bumps, along the bottom edge. You pick up one strand of the 2 strands of each stitch. Make sure that you have picked up the same number of stitches as you originally cast on. You are then ready to work your first row on your provisionally picked up stitches. In this case, I'm going to start with just a plain knit row. You can remove your waste yarn before doing this row, but I prefer to make sure that my stitches are all picked up before I remove my waste yarn. You are now ready to remove your waste yarn. As this was a crochet chain, you can pick out the yarn that you pulled through your last chain, and then, all going well, you should be able to unzip the chain. You may need to do a little bit of manipulation. For situations where this does not happen as easily as it did just there, just snip it out. Be careful not to snip your work though. You are now ready to continue working your project now that your provisional edge has been picked up.